The limiting factor between where your game development skills are at and where you want them to be is probably not books. Now, there's two different exceptions to that we're going to talk about. And as always in my videos, I'll also bring in some outside metaphor or analogy to connect this to maybe more relatable fields that have been around longer, more prevalent in our culture than game development. So the two cases where books are really tremendously helpful are if you're a complete beginner, they're super relevant and just sort of getting in a foundation to be able to do it at all. And if you're focused on something very advanced and narrow, either a deep specialty, like at a giant studio for graphics programming with optimizations and custom shaders and, unique OpenGL application techniques, or network backend optimizations, AI neural nets, etc., or for that matter, theoretical interests, which we might have even as designers. So some examples of books about like kind of that advanced theoretical interest. One of my graduate advisors, in fact, my PhD advisor, Dr. Celia Pierce, wrote Communities of Play about the emergent game communities that come from online play groups. Very interesting book, worthwhile discussion, but isn't going to move you from beginning game developer or non-game developer into building more advanced games. Grasshopper by Bernard Sweet's one of my favorite books as a researcher, literally philosophy. It has to do with how we use terms, implications of them, what we define as play. Interesting questions and valuable discussions to have. Also doesn't really help you build games. Ham on the Holodeck by Dr. Janet Murray, another one of the people on my graduate advisor committee. Also a great book from 20 years ago, relates directly to the emerging questions that come up about dynamic narrative design, about virtual reality, which of course is as relevant today as it ever was in the 90s, certainly. And it's something that is like I say, worthwhile theoretical discussion to have, interesting to us, but only really relevant at the emerging forefront of those kind of questions in a way that is harder to connect if you're at intermediate kind of level. And even something that maybe seems much more pragmatic in terms of core gameplay design down to the systems level. Game Feel by Steve Swink, one of my favorite practical books from Industry Writer. This is a book about loving these millisecond, moment-to-moment interactions, about our perceptual reflex, our time that it takes us to process information, about how differences in tuning curves can affect how heavy or light something feels. It's that kind of feel, by the way, not like feelings feels. And it's a valuable book, but it's also pretty advanced as far as game design goes, for it means that you can already build the games you're trying to build, and now you're trying to worry about these really fine, nuanced, detailed questions. That's what I mean by saying books can be valuable for very advanced and specific questions. On the far other end of the spectrum, self-plug coming up, Hands-on Intro to Game Programming is literally my textbook, and of course a digital copy. This is included in my Udemy courses, which I, like a course would often be structured, teach out of my textbook with me as the teacher. Textbooks, just like in a math class, history class, etc., are often meant to be digested through the facilitation of an instructor, where they're presenting the material, they're picking sections of it, they're highlighting, you're being walked through it, guided through it, and so on. And that literally is assuming, okay, you know nothing yet. Let's get you past knowing nothing yet into what are the different pieces and parts called, how do they fit together so we can do this at all, to lay a foundation of skills so you can then do it. But for the time in the middle, you have to be applying and doing the things that you know how to do, pushing those boundaries and practicing and drilling in. And so one of the examples we can use from outside of game development that I think a lot of people can immediately relate to is if you wanted to play a sport, baseball, bowling, soccer, football, you name it, there's two different perspectives we might read about that sport from. One could be, as a total beginner, I just need to know the terminology. What are these different positions called? What are the, just how can I even understand what a coach is telling me? Or the basic rules. How do I not do something that's just an obvious flub, like touch the ball with my hands in soccer? We could learn it from somebody else, or we could read it. On the far other end of the spectrum, there are books about, it's called The Philosophy of Sport, and they have to do with things like cultural implications of sports stadiums in our communities. They have to do with things like performative athleticism and beauty. They're all valid, interesting discussions to be having. They don't really help you go from not so good a basketball player to a slightly better one just by virtue of reading those books. It's about a different kind of discussion that we have in our culture. In the realm in the middle, you have to just practice that sport. You got to drill it. You got to play it. You got to go out to tournaments. You got to do it. And the other thing I like to draw upon, this comes, of course, because it's kind of how I structure a lot of my approach and why I call my methods hands-on, is that when I was a woodworking student in high school, we would spend our first week or two reading out of a textbook, taking some little written quizzes about shop safety, the names of different tools around the shop, basic cleaning measures, just these things that, cutting with a grain of wood and what difference that makes in the support and how easily it is, how to mount something to a lathe, how to even just identify costs of wood, raw estimates, and so on. These are basic skills that until you have those, you can't really operate in a wood shop. But after you understand those fundamentals, more reading isn't going to make you a better woodworker. You can't just sit there and read a textbook all year and come away a skilled woodworker. You got to be doing it. You got to be in there doing stuff with it. And again, we could easily picture there might be some very advanced woodworking writing about civil engineering and static construction, physics forces, and load-bearing dynamics, and all kinds of other physics questions, or maybe even ecological questions about trees and the Amazon and availability of materials and all kinds of other things that are important, valuable discussions to have that don't actually make you a better woodworker by virtue of sitting there reading those books. It's a different kind of discussion. In the middle, you just have to apply yourself with it. You just have to do it hands-on, practicing, and doing those kind of things. This is also why, out of the curriculum order that I teach and the sequence that I use in training people, why I didn't just make more Udemy courses. Because I get people who, they take my Udemy courses and they say like, oh, this was a great course, I found it helpful, yada, 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 again, ringing my own bell. They're like, why don't you make more video courses? Why don't you just make another book? And the reason is because that's not helpful. Because I tried through a lot of trial and error, through dozens of private training clients, the ones who I kept walking them through more and more advanced games, they became dependent on me to be able to answer questions that are really fundamental to being able to develop your own games. Because what people get into it for is that they want to be able to translate that they have an idea to playable game on screen. And doing that involves a lot of skills that aren't just how do I solve this particular programming puzzle, but how do I navigate that open-ended design space where at every single turn there's always an option of, okay, if I can't quite figure this out the way I thought I would do it, or if the way I thought I would do it isn't quite working out, how do I pivot my design in an appropriate way that still holds together as cohesive, but I can implement a different way? And this is what starts to inform our trade-offs when we're planning projects, when we're creating projects and envisioning what we're going to do on longer schedules, is this personal experience you accumulate of navigating that uncertainty of open-ended design, which can never come from following a video course or reading a textbook on it that walks you handheld through, first write this line, then write this line, write this function, then that function. If you do that, you're going to wind up in a pure implementer role where your only skill set's going to be hoping someone hands you a spec you can do something with. You got to knock those training wheels off. You got to get into open-ended projects. That's why for our club, just like my private training stuff, is all about what's the project you want to build. And this is also important because your motivation's got to be much higher if you're working on something that you care about, that's your game, and not just the kind of game that somebody else thought was useful as training wheels. And again, I think at a beginning level, those foundations, those fundamentals to get you across the line if you've never done something to now you have, are important because they help us size up the difficulty of things. They equip us with some baseline concepts of what does it take to put a graphic on the screen? What does it take to play a sound effect? What does it take just to move something around and detect if they overlap? Those kind of things you got to know. But once you have those in your skill set, you can't just sit there and just read and read and read, or watch and watch and watch and follow along exactly as tutorials show you and get better at the ability to take your idea and transform that into a live playable working game on the screen through a plan, through a teamwork, through self-project, or however you want to do it. That's just got to come from practice, pushing your own boundaries, push, 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 push. And that's where then, if you want to start having a practical implication of some of these more advanced books, totally can, because then you're in a position where you're not restricted by just struggling to make the idea work or to make the game releasable, to make it complete, to figure out how to put a menu on it. You can take for granted, okay, I'm comfortable with those. Let's start talking about the higher level of abstraction questions about how my players are going to relate to each other online, or about how I can tune my game in a very interesting way to achieve a certain effect at a very narrow level, because you're now able to do that without having to stress out about, can I do this at all? And that purely comes through practice. Again, just like sports, just like woodworking, etc., etc., etc. So that's it for today. Actually, one other quick note. Enjoy GameDev, our little online conference with 8 different speakers and some online networking between our peer attendees. It's coming up August 5th. You can find out more about that at enjoygamedev.com, or the previous video was actually some of the speakers hollering about what they're talking about. And of course, if you're seeing this video late after August 5th, 2017, there's also going to be a video of it. You can find it at enjoygamedev.com as well. That's it for now. Chris Steiner for GameKeto. Thanks for tuning in. Look forward to playing your games in the future. Bye for now.